Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're getting interactive due to a copyright block on The Shadows with their performance in 2009 of Shadugi. And you guys know what to do. The link is going to be in the description below to the video that I watched. I'm also going to pin it to the top of the comments so you guys can go there now, click on the link, watch the video and then come back here for the analysis, and I'll see you guys in the comments section. I'm just going to jump in here. As always, the link to this video is going to be in the description below, so you guys can check it out and watch it the whole way through without me interrupting. But The Shadows, one of those old-time bands originally brought together to be the backing band for Cliff Richard, and the Cliff Richard video that I have done, I do mention a bit about The Shadows, but I was asked to do a video just on The Shadows, putting the spotlight on them as a band because they were a standalone outfit as well. I think I've thrown in this stat before about The Shadows being the fourth most successful act of all time in the UK singles chart, and that's behind Elvis, the Beatles and Cliff Richard, and then it's The Shadows. So they really did dominate the charts for long periods here in the UK, and with Cliff, like I mentioned, they had massive success, but then managed to put together their own covers, but also original material with Hank Marvin on guitar, with his use of that whammy bar. I do have a designated video on Hank if you want to check that out independently, but getting into this performance because Hank is giving us some whammy bar action immediately in the intro by pushing down on that whammy bar, decreasing the tension on the strings, so that when he lets go of that whammy bar, the low E string that he's played then comes up to pitch as the tension then increases. So it gives it an interesting sound immediately, and Hank is all about using that whammy bar for vibrato as well, which gives his playing such a unique edge, because sometimes when you hear a player always vibratoing on the frets, it has a very particular sound. Sometimes players struggle to do that with the same frequency that they use with the whammy bar. But Hank just went exclusively to that whammy bar for vibrato. So it's such an even wave of vibrato. It has its own distinct sound. Also with Hank's playing, there is nowhere to hide because of the clarity of the tone. And there is a bit of reverb on the sound as well, something that was used in spades, especially back in the 60s. But it has been reined in a little bit for this performance, but that trademark reverb is still on there. With the tone that Hank plays with, like I say, there's nowhere to hide, and everybody knows how the song goes and how the melody goes for the lead guitar part with an instrumental piece. So not only is there nowhere to hide with the effects, but you've got to nail the melody and get it spot on. Something that is really important here that will fly under the radar if you don't play the guitar is the amount of muting going on by Hank in order to keep everything crystal clear with his playing, but more importantly, to keep the other strings quiet. Another thing to point out about The Shadows live performances is the choreography, and this is something that we're used to now, of course, but back in the 60s and the 70s, lots of bands would just stand and play, and there wouldn't be that extra form of entertainment by synchronizing movements. But The Shadows started to bring that to live performances, and they would kick their legs at the same time, synchronize all of their movements. You'll see it in this performance if you look out for it. The walking to the front of the stage, the walking back, walking in circles as well. If you're watching closely, you might have noticed how Hank anchors onto the body of the guitar with his little finger, and this will give him a solid reference point to pick out where each string is and get his alternate picking down to make sure that he doesn't miss any picks so that it's always really nice and clear, but he's also anchoring onto the guitar with his wrist. His wrist doesn't move, and this is something that gives you access to the low E string with your palm and with the fleshy part of your thumb. So it means that when you are playing the high E string, the B string, and the G string, you can keep those lower strings quiet, and more often than not, a player will move their hand with their pick in a downward direction so that that fleshy part of the hand follows the pick and starts to mute every string as the pick ascends the strings going all the way to the high E string. Obviously, I'm looking at it in quite a lot of detail, but if you just have started playing lead guitar and you want to keep those low strings quiet, the first port of call is the palm of your right hand, just to rest it on there, because it also gives you that position to be more accurate with your picking as well, is something that Hank is implementing here, and like I said, is essential to get such a clean sound from his lead work with such a clean tone. You'll also notice how Hank sometimes goes to that whammy bar consistently throughout a series of notes, which he does at 1 minute and 26, so you can rewind it if you want to hear that in action. It gives it that wobbly effect and will just give you some light and shade in the lead work, a little bit of difference between the expression of having straight notes, then straight notes with vibrato at the end, to then a consistent array of notes that all have a constant vibrato on them. Another little trick that Hank uses is pulling up on the whammy bar, like he does here when he hits a harmonic, and just increases that tension on the strings by pulling up, and therefore getting a nice resolution to the lead that he's playing. Is something that you can also achieve if you don't have a whammy bar, just by pushing on the strings beyond the nut on the headstock of the guitar. Just push on the strings there and you'll increase the tension. You can use that for vibrato on open strings, or to play an open string and just put it up a semitone. Notice as well how there's that swing in this composition. Is something that I've pointed out in other videos about the foot pedal on the drum kit that's going to be mostly responsible for putting that in, with the hi-hat as well. That can really exaggerate the swing and make it more prevalent, but the whole band are playing with that swing all on the same page, and that's why it's got that lift in there, because we're not playing straight. We'll be getting into a little bit of the background behind the shadows at the end of the video. We're going to be jumping back into the performance now, where Brian Bennett is about to play a little drum solo. And there we have it. Whenever I'm watching a performance by the Shadows, I can't help but smile because of the playing, but also the choreography. We saw it there, the left leg going over the right leg, just walking in a circle, is something that does make it interesting to watch. Apart from the interesting element of the execution musically that we've got, obviously being super tight is a given with an instrumental performance, and they are here. In relation to that tightness, let me mention Mark Griffiths on bass and Brian Bennett, who I mentioned earlier, on drums, because it all starts with that rhythm section. That has got to be rock solid, and they've got to have that groove and both be singing from the same hymn sheet with that swing, and they absolutely are, because that then lays the foundation for Hank to play the lead on top of. And if this wasn't tight, it just wouldn't work. Something that adds another dimension to Hank's lead work in this performance are those keys, because they are harmonizing with Hank's lead notes, and that is Warren Bennett on keys, which is Brian's son. But just a bit of history on the Shadows, because like I said, they were set up as a backing band for Cliff Richard, and we're talking about the late 50s here. 1958, they had their first hit, which was called Move It, and that was written by Ian Samwell, and at this point, they were known as Cliff Richard and the Drifters. So they wanted to release music over in the USA. They did have a song called Feelin' Fine that was released under that band name, but they were contacted by the management of the Drifters over in the USA. That name had already been taken, and they threatened Cliff and these guys, who were known as the Drifters at the time, with legal action. So they realized they needed a change of name pretty quickly. Just to mention that when they released Move It, Bruce Welch, who's playing rhythm guitar here, wasn't in the band yet, and neither was Hank Marvin. It all came about because the record label EMI, who signed Cliff Richard, were looking for a band but a lead guitarist as well. That's why they got Hank. Initially, they were looking for Tony Sheridan. They went to a gig to watch him, but Tony wasn't there and Hank was, and they liked the way that Hank looked and the way that he played, so they thought, well, we'll take this Hank Marvin guy for our band. So Hank and Bruce were then in the band from 1959, and 1960 is when they had their release of Apache, and this was a massive hit for the band, and it was a Jerry Lorden track written originally by him, but it really went down well in the UK and was a massive number one. So in 1961, they went through some personnel changes, and there were quite a few of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the interesting thing about this personnel change is that Tony Meehan went over to Decca Records in order to become a producer, and he was replaced by Brian Bennett. The other thing that happened was that Jet Harris left the band. He was replaced by Brian Locking, and then they released 7 singles as The Shadows with this new arrangement, new lineup. But then Harris and Meehan, who left the band, were now recording together, and they released a track called Diamonds in 1963, and that went to number 1 in the charts. So they followed that up with 2 more hits. In 1963, it turned out that The Shadows were now competing in the charts with Harris and Meehan, who had left the band. They'd been replaced. Throughout the 60s, they did a lot of work with Cliff because he was being very successful. John Rostill also joined the band. In 1967, they teamed up with Olivia Newton-John, and that was for the song The Day I Met Marie. In 1968, by the end of that year, unfortunately, they disbanded, and it wasn't until 1970, which would have been just over a year later, that Cliff Richard got his own TV show. So the guys got back together for that, and they went on to enter the Eurovision Song Contest, which is something that I've mentioned on this channel before. Just quickly, it's a competition in Europe where everyone's competing to have the best song, and all of the countries compete and vote. So they entered that and finished second with Let Me Be the One, and Bruce Welch supplied the lead vocal on that performance. In 1977, they released their album 20 Golden Greats, and that got to number 1 in the UK album charts. So due to that success, they went out on tour, and in the late 70s, they released their version of Don't Cry For Me Argentina, which got to number 5 in the charts. In 1979 is when they released their version of Cavatina, which is widely known as the theme to the Deer Hunter movie, and that was a top 10 hit as well. The album String of Hits got to the number 1 spot in the album charts as well, so they were flying high in the 70s. In 1980, they released their album Change of Address, and that was their first album with Polydor after changing record labels. In 1986, they released a covers album, and that was called Moonlight Shadows, and in 1989, they were reunited with Cliff Richard because they did a show with Cliff at Wembley Stadium, and in 1990, they played at the Nebworth Park concert, and that was for charity, where an estimated 120,000 people turned up to watch that. It was the same year in 1990 that they released the album Reflection, and they completed their final tour. So then in 2004, they started their farewell tour, and in 2009, they had their 50th anniversary tour. So they released an album as well, which is called Reunited, and that did really well. It got to number 4 here in the UK charts. But the important thing to remember about the Shadows as well is what an inspiration they were to the future generations of guitar players, especially with Hank's playing and the guitar being the focal point of the band. And guys like Mark Knopfler, Brian May, Eric Clapton, David Gilmour have all cited the Shadows as an inspiration to them musically, but also learning to play the guitar and having them as an influence with their guitar playing. So it's one of those things that you might not necessarily think about, but they have inspired so many people over the years. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!